That dam stays closed, or my husband's lawyers will bury you, you hillbilly engineer.
Whitney Vandermark stood on the spillway catwalk of my grandfather's 1948 earthen dam in $300 hiking boots, blonde ponytail whipping in the September wind, while 109 illegally built cabins sat below her along a shoreline that legally belonged to the bottom of my lake. Her HOA had spent 2 years building those cabins on land that was supposed to be 12 feet underwater. Her husband had sold lake access lies to every homeowner in 3 counties, and on the morning she stood on my dam screaming at me to abandon a federally mandated reservoir inspection, she had no idea that I'd already filed every permit, retained the best dam safety attorney in North Carolina, and given her HOA 90 days to remove those cabins, before I restored my grandfather's lake to its full legal pool. 90 days ended at midnight. The spillway gates opened at sunrise. What would you do if a Karen built 109 cabins on your private lake? Tell me below. Where are you watching from tonight? My name is Wyatt Honeycutt. I'm 47 years old, a recently retired hydraulic engineer who spent 22 years with the Tennessee Valley Authority, designing dam safety upgrades from the Great Smokies to the Cumberland Plateau. I came home to Avery County, North Carolina, in the spring of 2024 to take care of my father, Walter Honeycutt, 74, retired school teacher, early-stage Parkinson's, sharper than most men half his age on his good days. My family has owned 600 acres of the Blue Ridge Highlands above Beech Creek since 1923, when my great-grandfather, Avery Honeycutt, traded a pair of mules and a Stevens single-shot rifle for the original deed at the Avery County Courthouse. The lake, Honeycutt Lake, on every USGS map printed in the last 60 years, was built in 1948 by my grandfather, Otis Honeycutt, who was the sheriff of Avery County and a Korean War veteran and a self-taught civil engineer with an 8th-grade education and a slide rule he carried in his front shirt pocket every day for 35 years. He cut the spillway by hand. He poured the concrete core with 2 cousins and a mule named Francis. He filed every permit himself, in his own careful pencil block print, at a time when most rural North Carolina farmers built dams without bothering. The dam impounded 28 surface acres of cold mountain water, fed by 3 creeks. My grandfather used to say the lake was for trout, swimming, and the slow comfort of having something beautiful to look at from the front porch. My older sister, Hannah, died of ALS in November of 2023. She was 44. She left a husband and 2 teenage daughters in Asheville. She had been my best friend my whole life. She taught me to fly fish at this lake when I was 7, and she was 9. She had been a public defender in Buncombe County for 18 years, the kind of lawyer who would drive to a client's apartment at midnight in a snowstorm to keep a custody fight from collapsing. When the ALS diagnosis came in February of 2022, she did not tell anyone for 6 weeks. She wanted, she said later, to have one more spring on her feet. After her funeral, I quit TVA, sold my apartment in Knoxville, and moved back into the same upstairs bedroom I'd grown up in. I'm divorced. Quiet divorce, 9 years ago, no kids. I cook breakfast for my father every morning. On Saturdays, I walk the eastern shore of the lake with him, slow as he needs. And he tells me the same 3 stories about my grandfather that he's been telling me since I was 8. 2 miles north of our property, in 2021, a Charlotte developer named Preston Vandermark broke ground on a gated community he called Pinnacle Ridge Lake Estates. 120 homes, brick and cedar mountain houses with 3-car garages and stone fireplaces and koi ponds. The development sold out by Christmas of 2022. The marketing materials promised exclusive private lake access to a body of water the developer did not own and had no legal right to grant. The lake was Honeycutt Lake, my lake. Preston's wife, Whitney Vandermark, 41, blonde, polished, slightly heavy-set around the middle in a way she fought hard with daily Pilates. No children, 2 Cavalier King Charles Spaniels named Hennessy and Cabernet, became the inaugural president of the Pinnacle Ridge HOA in March of 2022. By July, she had passed a resolution declaring communal shoreline access to Honeycutt Lake. By November, they had built the first guest fishing cabin along the northern shoreline. By the time I moved home in March of 2024, there were 73. By September of 2025, there were 109. My father, who is a kind man and the son of a kind man, had been letting it slide. He had written one polite letter to the HOA in 2022, reminding them that the lake was private. They had replied with a 6-page response signed by Preston Vandermark, Esquire, asserting various theories of prescriptive easement, neighborly use, and established community access. My father had filed the letter in a green folder in his desk and gone back to his New York Times crossword. He had been waiting for me to come home. I spent my first 6 months home doing nothing about the cabins, partly because I was figuring out my father's medication schedule, partly because I wanted to understand the full scope, but mostly because I'd spent 22 years building dams for a living, and I knew that the slower you move at the start, the cleaner you cut at the end. In September of 2024, I drove up to the Pinnacle Ridge Clubhouse on a Tuesday evening. I wore khaki pants and a plain blue button-down. I parked at the back of the lot. I did not introduce myself. I sat in the back row with a yellow legal pad and a pen. Whitney Vandermark spent 20 minutes at the podium, discussing landscaping bids. She spent 4 minutes congratulating the HOA on hitting 107 completed lake cabins. She used phrases like, "our shared mountain heritage," and "the integrity of our community amenity." At 8:15, during public comment, I stood up. "Excuse me, Mrs. Vandermark, I'd like to introduce myself." She smiled the practiced smile of a woman who assumed every new face was a potential vote. "Of course. And you are?" "Wyatt Honeycutt." The room got very quiet. About 40 residents turned to look at me. Whitney's smile froze for 1/2 second and then reset. "Mr. Honeycutt, how nice. We've heard so much about your father." "I'm sure you have. I'm here to address one item not on tonight's agenda. The 107 cabins your community has built along the southern, eastern, and western shorelines of Honeycutt Lake." A short silence. Then Whitney laughed, a brittle laugh that came from somewhere behind her teeth. "Mr. Honeycutt, those cabins are well within the legally established shoreline access this community has enjoyed for decades. Your grandfather himself permitted recreational use of the lake. We have a clear prescriptive easement under North Carolina common law. My grandfather permitted neighbors to fish from the shore. He did not permit the construction of permanent structures. Permanent structures are part of the natural evolution of established use, Mr. Honeycutt. Your father did not object. My father wrote you a letter in 2022, and our council responded comprehensively." I tipped my head. "Mrs. Vandermark, I'm not here to argue prescriptive easement tonight. I'm here to let you know that the dam impounding Honeycutt Lake is overdue for its mandatory 10-year North Carolina Dam Safety Act inspection, which requires a full pool integrity test. The next inspection window is November of this year. Per the original 1948 design specifications and the 1971 Federal Floodplain Survey, the full pool elevation of Honeycutt Lake is 2,783 feet above sea level. The current pool is at 2,772 feet. There is, in other words, a roughly 11-foot discrepancy between the lake's current surface and its legal full pool." The room got very quiet. A thin retired engineer type in the third row opened his mouth slightly. "After my November inspection, I will be restoring the lake to its full legal pool. Per the original dam permit, this is the lake's designed elevation. It is also, by my calculation, approximately the elevation at which most of your 107 cabins will be sitting in 4 to 11 feet of water. I'm letting you know tonight, 6 weeks in advance, so that your community has the opportunity to remove the structures before the test." Whitney's mouth opened. It stayed open for about 3 seconds. Then she said, in a voice an octave higher than the one she'd been using, "Officer, this man is threatening our community. I want him removed from this meeting." There was no officer. There was the maintenance manager, a 50-year-old man named Lonnie Garrett, who looked at Whitney like she'd asked him to perform surgery. "I'll see myself out. My attorney will follow up in writing within 2 weeks. Good evening." I walked out. I drove home. I sat with my father on the porch and watched the moon rise over the eastern shore of a lake that had been ours since 1948. He did not say much. He just put his good hand on my shoulder and let it rest there. The white pines moved in the dark. A great horned owl called from the eastern ridge twice and then went silent. My father said, after a long minute, "Wyatt, Your grandfather built that dam to be filled, not for show. He filled it to 4 feet below the design pool the year I was born, and he ran it that way until his heart gave out in 1973. Whitney Vandermark does not know how big the lake is supposed to be. We do. He patted my shoulder once and went inside to make tea. I sat alone on the porch for another hour and watched the moon clear the ridgeline and silver the surface of the water that was, by every map and permit and grant of impoundment ever filed in Raleigh, mine. Whitney's first countermove came in writing, 5 days later, a 9-page letter on Vandermark Law Group letterhead, copied to every Pinnacle Ridge homeowner, threatening me under 17 different theories, ranging from prescriptive easement to outrageous infliction of emotional distress. The letter was signed by Preston Vandermark, J.D., Whitney's husband, formerly a real estate attorney at one of Charlotte's largest firms, retired at 52 to consult selectively. I had my own attorney by then. Her name was Cassandra Boone, 62 years old, 3rd generation Eastern North Carolina, partner at a 6-person firm in Boone that specialized in 3 things: dam safety, riparian rights, and Appalachian land disputes. She'd been recommended to me by my old TVA supervisor. She'd told me, in our first meeting, that I had what she called a beautiful case, and that she'd been waiting 20 years for an HOA to do something this stupid. Cassandra responded to Preston's letter with 1 page containing 3 sentences. Mr. Vandermark, the Honeycutt family has owned the dam, the impoundment, the shoreline easement, and all riparian rights to Honeycutt Lake since 1948 pursuant to a properly recorded grant of impoundment from the state of North Carolina. Your community's structures lie within the lake's recorded full pool footprint and are subject to inundation upon any lawful operation of the dam at design capacity. Please direct further correspondence to my office. She mailed it certified. Preston did not respond for 9 days. In the meantime, Whitney did what every antagonist on earth eventually does. She escalated publicly. She emailed every Pinnacle Ridge resident a mass communication titled, "Urgent," defending our community from hostile outside action. The email described me as an aggressive recent transplant attempting to seize community land through bad faith environmental claims. It included 3 photographs of my father, taken without permission from a passing car, and accused me, in language that was almost but not quite actionable, of elder financial manipulation. My father read the email at the kitchen table on a Friday morning. He looked up at me with the gentle, slightly trembling smile he'd been wearing since the Parkinson's had started. "Son, she called me a victim of elder manipulation. By you." "Yes, sir." He laughed. He laughed for about 40 seconds, a small, wheezy laugh that ended in a coughing fit. When it finished, he was the brightest he'd been in 3 weeks. "Wyatt, your grandfather would have liked this woman. He'd have liked her because she's going to make this whole story so much better than it was already going to be. Don't you stop her. Let her keep going. The dumber she gets, the prettier the lake's going to look in November." By the end of the week, Whitney had organized a Pinnacle Ridge Shoreline Preservation Committee. By Tuesday, 3 different state agencies, Wildlife Resources, Environmental Quality, and Dam Safety, had received separate complaints alleging that my November inspection was a weaponized flooding event. Cassandra called me Wednesday morning, laughing. "Wyatt, they've just filed 3 complaints with 3 agencies that all report to one director, who happens to be a man I've known since 1986, who happens to think very poorly of Charlotte real estate attorneys, who happens to be planning a fishing trip to Honeycutt Lake the 2nd weekend in October." "Cassandra, what's his name?" "Joe Cantrell, State Dam Safety Engineer for the Western District. I worked with Joe at TVA in 2009. "I know." The state agencies dismissed all 3 complaints within 10 business days. By the 2nd week of October, Whitney had run out of agencies to complain to and started running her playbook in directions I had not expected. On a Tuesday afternoon, my father's home health aide, a kind woman named Loretta Murchison, called me from her cell phone in our driveway. Her voice was shaking. "Mr. Honeycutt, there's 2 men here. They say they're from Pinnacle Ridge Security. They want me to let them into the house to do a wellness check on your father. They have a clipboard." I was 20 minutes away in Boone, picking up my father's prescription refills. I told Loretta to lock the door and to call the sheriff. I called the sheriff myself from the truck. I drove home at speeds I will not put in writing. When I pulled into the driveway, the two men were gone. The deputy, an old high school classmate of mine named Brody Calloway, now Sergeant Calloway, was sitting on the front porch with my father and Loretta. "Wyatt, they're gone. We got plate numbers. They were a couple of Pinnacle Ridge HOA board members. Some guy named Foster Knox and a woman named Mindy Ostergaard. They claimed they had, quote-unquote, welfare concerns about your dad. Whitney Vandermark sent them. No clear basis, just trying to get inside the house and get their hands on documents." Walter Honeycutt rose from his rocking chair, slowly, and put his hand on my forearm. "Son, I'm fine. They didn't get inside. Loretta did everything right." He squeezed my arm. "But Whitney just made a mistake. She came to my house. She came at me. Whitney's been a fool, but she'd been a careful fool. Now she's not. Now we have a story." He was right. By Friday morning, Sheriff Mathis had referred the trespass complaint to the Avery County DA. By Friday afternoon, the local newspaper, the Avery Journal, had picked up the story under a front-page headline: HOA officials accused of unauthorized visit to elderly resident. By Saturday morning, Cassandra had filed an emergency motion in Avery County Superior Court, seeking a temporary restraining order against the entire Pinnacle Ridge HOA board. The judge, a 58-year-old Avery County native named Sandra Greaves, who had attended kindergarten with my mother, granted the motion within 4 hours. By Sunday night, an investigative reporter from the Charlotte Observer named Rebecca Park had called me asking for comment on what she described as a developing story about North Carolina HOA aggression and questionable real estate practices in the Blue Ridge. I gave Rebecca my number and told her to call me back Monday. Whitney had spent 2.5 years building 109 cabins on a lake she did not own. She had spent the last 6 weeks building 1 defamation suit, 3 administrative complaints, 2 attempted home invasions, and a Charlotte Observer feature. Cassandra started a fresh manila folder labeled Notice, Intentional Conduct. By the end of October, it had 38 documents in it. The dam inspection was scheduled for November 14th. I had decided, after the home health aide incident, that the test would not happen as a quiet engineering exercise. It would happen as a public event. The reveal that turned a strong case into an unwinnable one for Whitney did not come from my dad, or from Cassandra, or from Joe Cantrell, or from me. It came from the original 1948 dam construction file. In the second week of October, Cassandra's paralegal, a 30-year-old woman named Della Yost, who had grown up in Beach Creek, drove to the North Carolina State Archives in Raleigh and pulled the complete construction file. The file was 8 inches thick. It contained my grandfather's original 1948 dam permit application, the 1948 floodplain survey, the original grant of impoundment from the state of North Carolina, every annual inspection report from 1949 through 2024. And one document Della called me about from her hotel room on a Wednesday night. "Wyatt, you need to see this. I just photographed it." She sent me a JPEG. It was a 1973 letter on State of North Carolina Department of Natural Resources letterhead, addressed to Otis Honeycutt at the Beach Creek Post Office, signed by the regional dam safety engineer of the period, a man named Glenn Hartford. The letter informed my grandfather that, following his heart attack of January 1973, the state was granting him a temporary operational variance, allowing him to maintain the reservoir at a reduced pool elevation of 2,772 feet, 11 feet below the design full pool of 2,783 feet. The variance was temporary. The variance was to be reviewed every 10 years. The variance did not extinguish the lake's full legal footprint. The variance specifically reserved the family's right to restore the lake to its full pool at any time, with 30 days' notice to the state. The variance had been reissued every 10 years since 1973. The most recent reissuance was 2023. It expired November 1st, 2025, 13 days before my scheduled inspection. When the variance expired, the lake legally returned, by operation of state law, to its full pool elevation of 2,783 feet, not as my election, as a matter of automatic statutory reversion. The Honeycutt family did not need to ask permission to fill the lake. The variance had been keeping it low. The variance was expiring. The lake's legal default was full. Every one of Whitney Vandermark's 109 cabins had been built between 2022 and 2025, inside a footprint that the state of North Carolina had been explicitly, by recorded letter, identifying as the lake's full legal pool for 52 years. I sat in my father's kitchen with the phone in my hand and the JPEG on my screen and did not move for about 3 minutes. Then I called my father in. I showed him the letter. He read it slowly, his good hand on the paper, his lips moving once with my grandfather's name. He looked up at me with that patient, half smile. "Son, your grandfather knew. He kept the variance because he was tired. He kept it temporary because he wanted his son or his grandson to decide. He never wanted to make that decision for either of us. Wyatt, you get to decide whether to fill the lake." I thought about it for one long minute. "Pop, the variance expires anyway. I don't have to decide." He smiled. Even better. I poured him a glass of buttermilk from the fridge. He drank half of it with his good hand. I put the JPEG up on the laptop again and walked through the 1973 letter sentence by sentence with him. He had been 33 years old when his father had the heart attack. He remembered the variance. He remembered the lake dropping 11 feet that summer. He remembered fishing the lower shoreline that fall and finding the old root systems exposed in the mud. The way a child remembers a thing that doesn't seem strange until much later. "Pop, did Grandpa ever tell you why he kept the variance temporary?" "Once. He told me he was tired, but he wasn't done. He told me he was leaving the lake half empty, so that whoever loved it the most would get to fill it. He never said which of us he meant." He set the buttermilk down. "I think it turns out he meant you." For the next 3 weeks, Cassandra and I built the most cleanly choreographed dam restoration in North Carolina Blue Ridge history. Cassandra filed 3 documents in Raleigh. The first was a notice of variance non-renewal. The second was a routine 10-year dam safety inspection notice, scheduled for November 14, 2025, requiring full pool integrity testing per the North Carolina Dam Safety Act. The third was a recorded restatement of the original 1948 grant of impoundment, with the modern surveyed full pool footprint attached as an exhibit. The footprint encompassed every one of Whitney's 109 cabins. The legal mechanics are worth explaining in plain English. A dam owner in North Carolina holds 3 interlocking property interests. First, fee simple ownership of the dam and impoundment structure. Second, an easement over the full pool footprint of the reservoir, which is a property right that runs with the land. Third, riparian and water rights to the entire body of impounded water. When somebody builds a structure inside the reservoir's full pool footprint without the dam owner's permission, that structure is subject to inundation. Translation: when the lake comes up to its legal pool, the structure goes under, and the builder has no claim against the dam owner. A lake's legal footprint is bigger than the water you see. Joe Cantrell drove up to Beach Creek the second weekend in October, as planned. He brought his fishing rod, his 16-year-old grandson Casey, and his official inspection clipboard. He spent 2 days walking the dam, the spillway, the gatehouse, and every survey marker my grandfather had pounded into the granite outcrops along the original shoreline in 1948. He found 3 of the original brass benchmarks still legible after 77 years. He photographed each one. He checked their elevations against the modern GPS survey Della had commissioned. Every benchmark was within 1/8 of an inch of its 1948 elevation. My grandfather, working with a slide rule and a Stanley Transit and a self-taught engineer's stubborn patience, had set the lake out so cleanly that 3/4 of a century of frost heave and mountain weather had moved nothing important. Joe filed his preliminary report on a Tuesday morning. The report certified the dam structurally sound for full pool operation. The report also noted, in standard regulatory language, that the dam owner's restoration of the reservoir to its design pool elevation in November 2025 will eliminate certain unpermitted structures observed within the reservoir's recorded easement, the responsibility for which lies entirely with the parties who erected said structures. Rebecca Park at the Charlotte Observer published her first feature on a Sunday morning. The piece ran above the fold under the headline, "The Lake the HOA Thought It Owned." 4,000 words, aerial drone footage, a side-by-side of the 1948 floodplain survey and the current shoreline. Interviews with 7 Pinnacle Ridge homeowners who had been told by Preston Vandermark's marketing team that their cabins came with guaranteed lakefront. By Tuesday, 22 of them had retained their own lawyers. By Wednesday, a class action complaint was filed against Preston Vandermark personally, alleging fraudulent inducement in the sale of cabin lots that had been knowingly built within a recorded reservoir easement. The plaintiff list grew to 41 homeowners by Friday. None of them had been told about the variance. None of them had been told about the 1948 floodplain survey. None of them had been told that the lake they had paid premium lot prices to live next to was legally supposed to be 12 feet higher than it currently was. I delivered 90-day written notice to the Pinnacle Ridge HOA on October 14th, exactly as I had promised at the September meeting. The notice gave the HOA until January 12, 2026, to remove all 109 cabins from the recorded reservoir footprint. The notice was certified mail. Whitney Vandermark refused delivery. Cassandra had it served by an Avery County Sheriff's deputy the next morning, formally and with body camera footage. Whitney called an emergency meeting that Friday night. She announced, to a clubhouse that was already half empty, that the HOA would be filing an emergency injunction to prevent me from operating my dam at Design Pool. The injunction was filed Monday morning. Sandra Greaves denied it within 6 hours. Her written ruling contained one sentence I taped to my refrigerator. The court finds no statutory or equitable basis upon which a homeowners association may compel a private dam owner to permanently abandon the design capacity of his lawfully permitted reservoir for the convenience of structures the homeowners association built inside that reservoir without permission. The November 14th inspection was now 7 days away. Whitney spent those 7 days trying every door, knob, and window she could think of. She filed an appeal with the North Carolina Court of Appeals. The court dismissed it within 48 hours as procedurally premature. She hired a Raleigh public relations firm called Carlisle Strategic Communications and authorized $55,000 from the HOA reserve to manage the optics. The firm withdrew within 3 days, citing irreconcilable ethical concerns. She drove personally to my front gate on a Wednesday morning in her white Range Rover. She honked. She got out. She walked up the driveway in her $300 hiking boots and a cream cashmere sweater and stood at the bottom of my front porch steps. "Mr. Honeycutt, may I speak with you?" My father was on the porch in his rocking chair, wrapped in the blue afghan my mother had crocheted for him in 1991. Loretta Murchison was reading him the New York Times book review. "Mrs. Vandermark, you're in violation of the restraining order. I'm here on behalf of my community. I'm here to ask you, one neighbor to another, to reconsider. Mrs. Vandermark, you are within 30 feet of my father, in violation of a court order signed by Judge Sandra Greaves. I'm asking you to leave." She took one step closer. "Mr. Honeycutt, please. There are children. There are families. These are people's investments." "Mrs. Vandermark, they are also 109 illegally built structures within a recorded reservoir easement. I'm closing this door now. I am calling the sheriff." I closed the door. I called Brody Calloway. Brody arrived in 12 minutes. Whitney was still standing at the bottom of the porch steps, recording on her phone, crying decoratively. Brody arrested her on the spot for violation of the restraining order. The arrest happened in front of my father, who watched from the rocking chair without expression, and Loretta, who said later that Walter had whispered "good" under his breath as the cuffs went on. The arrest hit the Avery Journal Thursday morning and the Charlotte Observer Thursday afternoon. By Friday, 3 Pinnacle Ridge board members had publicly resigned. By Saturday, Preston Vandermark had retained a Charlotte defense firm separate from his wife's and filed an emergency motion to recuse himself from any further HOA legal involvement. I spent Saturday afternoon at the dam with Joe Cantrell, walking the spillway, the gate stem, the bypass valves, and the emergency drawdown channels. Every system green, every elevation marker calibrated. We posted a public safety advisory with the county. Sheriff Mathis put deputies on each access road into the cabin zone starting Monday morning. I called Preston Vandermark personally on Monday morning. "Mr. Vandermark, the cabins on the eastern, western, and southern shorelines are going to be inundated starting Friday morning. Most of the buildings will be partially or fully submerged within 72 hours. I am giving you one last courtesy notice to advise your homeowners to remove personal property. The water is rising legally, and there is no court in this state that will stop it." Preston was quiet for about 8 seconds. "Mr. Honeycutt, I appreciate the call. I will pass the message along." 22 of the cabin owners cleared out their cabins between Tuesday and Thursday. The other 87 owners, most of them in Whitney's HOA circle, did not. Friday morning broke clear and cold over the Blue Ridge. I woke at 4:30 and could not get back to sleep. I made coffee. I sat with my father at 5:30 while he ate oatmeal slowly with his good hand, and I cut his banana into small pieces for him. I drove him to the dam at 6:15. Loretta drove behind us. So did Cassandra Boone. So did Rebecca Park with a video crew. When we arrived at the dam access road, there were already 42 people waiting in the parking lot above the spillway. The mountain air was cold enough to fog every breath. The pre-dawn sky was the color of cast iron going slowly to pewter. Somewhere on the eastern ridge, a screech owl called twice and then went silent. The crowd parted gently as I drove through, and I waved at faces I had known since I was 8. Joe Cantrell, his grandson, Brody Calloway in uniform, Sheriff Mathis, Judge Sandra Greaves, off-duty, in a green Carhartt jacket, the thin retired engineer from the September HOA meeting, who turned out to be a retired U.S. Army Corps of Engineers colonel named Brian Quinlan, who had driven up from Statesville to watch, 2 reporters from WLOS Asheville, 3 drone operators with FAA-approved waivers, a retired pastor from Beach Creek Methodist, who had baptized me in the lake in 1992, 3 of the Pinnacle Ridge residents who had cleared out their cabins early, with a thermos of coffee and a half-dozen biscuits with country ham to share. Whitney Vandermark was not there. Preston Vandermark was not there. I walked my father to a folding chair at the overlook above the spillway. Loretta brought a wool blanket. Brody handed him a paper cup of coffee. At 7 a.m. sharp, Joe Cantrell walked the perimeter check one last time. Then he walked back to where I stood at the radial gate control panel. "Wyatt, the dam is yours. The reservoir is yours. The decision is yours, whenever you're ready." I looked at my father. He nodded. I picked up the handset. I called my downstream creek monitoring station. The technician confirmed clear gauges. I called the upstream tributary stations, all 3 flowing normal. I called the county dispatch, all clear. I unlocked the radial gate panel with the brass key my grandfather had carried in his front shirt pocket every day for 35 years. I turned the key. The motor hummed. The gate began to rise. The bypass channel that had been holding the lake at 2,772 feet for 52 years began to close. The spillway intake gates rotated downward. The upstream creek flow began, for the first time since January 1973, to fill the lake at full design rate. The water rose 2 inches the first hour, 8 inches by noon, 18 inches by sundown. We sat on the overlook through the day. Joe ate a country ham biscuit. My father told the same 3 stories about my grandfather he'd been telling since I was 8. Pastor Edmonds said a quiet prayer at noon for the slow restoration of things that were always supposed to be. At sundown, I drove my father home. The lake had risen 26 inches. 41 of Whitney Vandermark's cabins had water inside the first floor. My father did not say a word the whole drive back. When I helped him out of the truck at the bottom of our front porch steps, he looked up at me with the same level, slightly trembling smile he had been wearing since the Parkinsons started. "Wyatt, your grandfather would have liked today." "Yes, sir." "He'd have liked the part where you turned the key. He'd have liked the silence afterward. He'd have liked the way the water came in like it was returning home." I put my hand under his elbow and walked him up the steps. The lake would continue to rise for 3 more days. The lake rose 12 to 15 inches per day, exactly per the design specifications my grandfather had filed in 1948. By Saturday noon, 63 cabins had water inside. By Saturday evening, 81 cabins had floors submerged. By Sunday morning, every one of the 109 cabins was at least partially flooded. Rebecca Park's drone crew filmed the rising water from a quarter-mile up. The footage looked like a slow tide coming in over a model railroad village. Cabins disappearing from the deck up. roofs sinking to ridgeline, white propane tanks bobbing loose like beach balls, and being collected by Joe Cantrell's grandson in a rented John boat with a polite recovery permit. Whitney Vandermark surfaced on Sunday afternoon. She showed up at the Pinnacle Ridge Clubhouse for an emergency homeowners meeting. The clubhouse was packed. The Charlotte Observer was there. WLOS was there. The Asheville Citizen-Times was there. 3 Charlotte television stations were there. Whitney did not get to give her speech. A homeowner named Marlena Pickett, 68, retired oncology nurse, owned cabin number 37 on the southern shore, had been a vocal Whitney loyalist for 2.5 years, stood up in the front row before Whitney reached the podium. "Whitney, sit down. We need a vote of no confidence in the board, right now." Whitney's face cycled colors. The vote was held by paper ballot. The cable feed went out live to every household in Avery County. The vote was 86 in favor of removal, 3 against, 1 abstention. Whitney Vandermark was ejected as president of the Pinnacle Ridge Lake Estates Homeowners Association at 4:43 p.m. on Sunday, November 16, 2025. Marlena Pickett was elected interim president by acclamation at 4:47. Marlena's first official act was to call me on her cell phone from the clubhouse floor and ask if I would be willing to meet with a delegation of homeowners on Monday morning. I told her I would. Monday morning, I met 7 Pinnacle Ridge homeowners in Cassandra's Boone office at 8 a.m. We talked for 3 hours. By the time we left, we had a framework. Cassandra and I would offer recorded shoreline leases to any homeowner whose cabin was located on the historical 1948 high water mark or above, at a fair market annual rate, fully recorded and transferable. We would not offer leases for any cabin built below the historical waterline, because those cabins were now legally lake floor and could not be rebuilt. 26 of the 109 cabins met the high water mark criterion. The other 83 were gone. Whitney was arrested again on Wednesday on a new charge, felony embezzlement, related to the $55,000 she had authorized to Carlisle Strategic Communications without board approval. By the end of the year, Whitney faced 8 criminal counts. She pled guilty in February of 2026 to 4: embezzlement, 2 counts of trespass, and 1 count of violating a restraining order, and received 22 months in state prison, 2,000 hours of community service, and a lifetime ban from serving on any homeowners association in the state of North Carolina. She did not request mercy at sentencing. She did not look at me when the bailiff took her into custody. She looked, briefly, at my father, who had attended the sentencing in his rocking chair, pushed up against the gallery wall, blue Afghan across his lap, and who gave her one small, slow nod that said neither forgiveness nor cruelty. Preston Vandermark settled the class action homeowner suit for $3.8 million in March 2026. He surrendered his North Carolina bar membership in April. He moved to Florida in May. The lake, Honeycutt Lake, settled at its full design pool of 2,783 feet on a Thursday morning in late November, exactly where my grandfather had set it in 1948. It was the deepest, coldest, clearest blue I had ever seen it. 6 months later, on a warm morning in late May 2026, the Honeycutt Family Lake Conservation Trust held its first public event. The trust covered the 420 acres of shoreline and watershed that surrounded Honeycutt Lake. We'd granted it a permanent conservation easement in March, ensuring no developer would ever plat the property again. The trust planned to use the land for guided fishing trips for veterans, a summer field school for Beach Creek elementary kids interested in hydrology and watershed science, and an annual fly fishing tournament whose proceeds funded ALS research in honor of my sister Hannah. 26 recorded shoreline leases had been signed with Pinnacle Ridge Estates homeowners. The annual ground rent paid for the conservation easement, the field school, the veterans program, the ALS tournament, and a small monthly stipend for my father's home health care. Loretta Murchison was elected, by unanimous vote of the Honeycutt family, which is to say my father and me, to chair the Conservation Trust's first Community Advisory Board. She accepted with tears in her eyes, and a handwritten speech that thanked my grandfather, my father, and every person in Beach Creek who knew what water was for. Joe Cantrell retired from the state of North Carolina in February. He bought a small fishing cabin on the legal high water mark of the lake, the first lease Cassandra and I signed. His grandson Casey came up most weekends and helped my father with the bird feeders and the porch railing and the slow rebuilding of an old wooden john boat in the back barn. By April, Casey had decided he wanted to study civil engineering at NC State. He told me this on a Saturday morning while we sat at the dam overlook with 2 mugs of coffee. I told him my grandfather would have approved. Joe Cantrell, 20 feet away with a fly rod, pretended not to hear us. He smiled the whole time anyway. Marlena Pickett ran for Avery County Commissioner in November and won by 61 points. Her first act in office was to introduce a county ordinance requiring HOA developers to disclose every recorded easement and impoundment footprint within 5 miles of any new development. The ordinance passed unanimously. 3 Avery County developers withdrew incomplete subdivision plats within a month. Cassandra Boone published a chapter on the Pinnacle Ridge case in a national property law treatise in the spring. She titled the chapter, "Reservoir Easements: Why You Should Never Build a Cabin Inside a Lake." She sent me a signed copy with a handwritten note that read, "For Wyatt, the beautiful case I waited 20 years for. I keep it on the shelf above my grandfather's slide rule." The 83 cabins below the high water mark were never rebuilt. Some of them are still down there, settling into the lake floor under 12 feet of cold blue water, where the trout swim through their kitchens every spring. The Pinnacle Ridge Estates HOA agreed, by unanimous resident vote, to fund a small floating dock on the legal lakeshore, available to all residents through their leases, with no further claims to the lake itself. Marlena cut the ribbon on that dock in April. My father attended in his rocking chair, parked at the far end of the dock, and gave the closing benediction in a voice that was steady the whole way through. My father attended the Conservation Trust's first event in his rocking chair, wrapped in the blue Afghan, with a thermos of coffee and a fishing rod he had not used in 11 years. I helped him cast once into the cold mountain water. A rainbow trout hit on the 3rd drift. My father reeled it in, slow, careful, his good hand steady on the cork grip. Joe Cantrell unhooked it for him. We released it back. My father watched it disappear into the depths of a lake that was, for the first time in 52 years, full. He looked up at me with the small, slow smile that had been my whole childhood. "Wyatt." "Yes, sir." "Your grandfather's standing right here. I can feel him." I put my hand on his shoulder. The wind moved through the white pines. "Pop, so can I." The trout I had released swam down into the cold mountain dark. The wind kept moving through the white pines. My father closed his eyes for one slow second under the warm afternoon sun, and when he opened them, he was 8 years old again, and standing on this same shoreline beside his own father, watching a different rainbow trout disappear into the same blue water, 70 years before any HOA in 3 counties had ever heard of Honeycutt Lake. That, I thought, was what the variance had been waiting for. That was what my grandfather had left half empty. That was what Whitney Vandermark had never understood. A lake is not water. A lake is patience. We drove home slow that evening through the dogwoods. The lake stayed full behind us. It still does. If you've ever watched a Karen build something she didn't own on land that wasn't hers, I want to hear your story in the comments below. Tell us what happened. Tell us where you're watching from. And if this story made you feel something, pride, justice, the slow, patient logic of a man who waited until the variance expired, hit subscribe and stick around. Next week, a Navy veteran takes on an HOA that fined her for flying the flag. You won't believe what she did with the fines.